And on that note, I would like to bring Bruce Delgado to the virtual stage. Bruce is our plenary speaker and our session chair for managing invasive plants. Hi there, Bruce.
Hello, Thor.
Bruce has been working with the Bureau of Land Management since 1988, and in 1993, he took an assignment as a botanist at Fort Ord Public Lands, which is now known as Fort Ord National Monument. And I was fortunate enough back in 1998 to get an internship with BLM at Fort Ord through both BLM and the Watershed Institute at CSU Monterey Bay. So I got to spend the summer with Bruce one year and hanging out, smashing weeds and talking about habitat restoration and attending my first ever SERCAL conference and CalIPSI conferences, which was great. It was very inspirational for me. I learned tons, and I've been so privileged to have Bruce as a mentor for me for the last 22 years. And I know he hasn't just touched me, he's touched many of us in our field of work. So I know many of you know of Bruce, have worked with Bruce. And if you haven't worked with Bruce, I'm really happy to bring Bruce to the stage today. He has a lot to share, and he's a great resource for all of us. So without further ado, my good friend Bruce and habitat restoration legend, Bruce Delgado. Thanks, Bruce.
All right. Thank you very much, Thor. It's been great to know you and so many people that are in this restoration field and that are on this call today. Thanks everybody for joining the event. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Thor, I'm ready to share my screen. It says I have to wait a bit. Okay.
Yep.
Well, all right. Welcome everyone to this SERCAL 2020 kickoff presentation. I think we're all fortunate to do what we do, but these are tough times. And so trying to keep it real and keep it in real time, I think we have to recognize pandemics and social unrest, economic recessions and climate change. They're all stressors to our jobs, our work budgets, our personal lives. And our creativity and our enhanced partnerships on personal and on professional levels can help us do a better job as a team to help our wildlands on which all of our lives depend. Part one of this presentation is about us, and part two is about our profession with lots of overlap. Part one is a 10-minute attempt to dive personally into the social unrest in our country. My intent is not to offend anyone, but to engage us in a meaningful process to help our restoration industry grow and include more slices of America in our fields of science and conservation. SERCAL has recognized that our restoration industry is affected by systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. My job in the next 9 minutes is to address in part one what this means. And the first concept I'd like to discuss is in regards to the creativity and partnerships on the personal level of our trusted five. Outside of your family, who are the five most trusted allies in your life? Just think about that. Are they diverse, or do they think like you? Do they share similar backgrounds and social identities? My trusted five are not diverse, and that's been comfortable for me, but it's something that I would like to change. This is a deep dive into who I am and who you all are. How we feel of ourselves is often with some of these most common identities. Unconsciously or not, we may feel proud of being in some groups and ashamed of being in others. This is personal and highly subjective. You get to fill it out any way that feels accurate for you on your own time. You may check some boxes in the dominant, others in the marginalized columns. Depends on how you've experienced life. My family was terrorized when I was young for being a Mexican family. I learned then I was Mexican, and that some thought I was second class because of that. I believed it, along with criticisms or misinformation that I heard about this and other of my identities in the marginalized column. I also feel superior or somewhat righteous or entitled because of other identities I have that I think are dominant in our society. A major point here is that if you're aware, you feel proud or ashamed for any of your identities, you can start to have empathy for others who feel the same for their identities. I get a laugh out of what a friend told me recently, that some people with dominant identities think they hit a triple to have these identities, when in reality, they were born on third base with these identities. This discussion has been a build-up to racism and internalized oppression. The next two slides are the most important for me to understand Black Lives Matter movement on a personal level. Racism is a system of beliefs and behaviors that assumes the superiority of one ethnicity over another. Conscious or unconscious, implicit, explicit, they result in the oppression, usually of people of color, for the benefit of the dominant group. A simpler definition for racism is racial prejudice plus power equals racism. So if I'm a Caucasian, I think I'm superior to Mexicans, and I have the power to purposefully not hire Mexicans, and I don't hire them because they're Mexican. That would be racism by this simpler definition. Internalized oppression or internalized dominance is huge for me. I recently realized how much it's driven my psyche all my life, and I didn't even know what it was. For me, it's how I've been affected internally by being treated as second class for being Mexican. The internalized impact is that I believed this misinformation and I undervalued myself and other Mexicans. But the worst part about this may be how internalized oppression and dominance affects how I undervalue and maybe mistreat other marginalized groups about which I've also received misinformation, such as women, African Americans, physically, emotionally disabled, non-English speakers, currently homeless, farm workers, old people, overweight people. I experience a disconnect with members of these oppressed groups. Well, this has been pretty isolating for me to not be able to feel close or equal or trusting with the majority of people in my life. I start to understand how African American Black Lives Matter protesters may feel anger and frustration with both racism and their own internalized oppression. I start to understand my own sense of dominant identities and my dominance or my entitlement-related flaws. So you can have racism on an individual or systemic basis. At the individual level, it's beliefs and attitudes of individuals, actions that we take that lead to racism. They can be conscious or unconscious, passive or active, telling a racist joke, or believing in the inherent superiority of one ethnicity can lead to individual racism. Systemic racism is policies, practices that create different results for different racial groups. Institutional policies may never mention a racial group, but their effect is to create advantages for a dominant ethnicity at the disadvantage to a marginalized people. For example, not too long ago, there were government policies that restricted the ability of people to get loans to buy homes in minority neighborhoods. That was known as redlining. The disproportionate use of minority communities for industrial facilities like landfills, power plants, sewage treatment plants, sand mines, oil refineries, that they're placed in minority communities often is a result of systemic racism. Our last concept in this discussion is understanding that terminology is paramount to having meaningful conversation on social justice matters. Diversity, inclusion, equity are each different. They're not synonymous. Diversity exists when your environment includes a variety of working styles, ideas, and experiences being represented by individuals themselves coming from different social identities or cultures. Inclusion boils down to supporting and valuing authentic participation of any individual or group. So if a highly qualified but first African American on your field crew or your management staff quits after 2 months, it's not a failure of diversity. It's perhaps a failure of the inclusiveness of your environment that wasn't well adjusted for people of color to fit in. So how can our creativity lead more young people, more people of color to participate in boards of directors and management leadership positions for natural resource nonprofits and agencies? It may require a disruption of the Eurocentric traditional perspectives that are not shared by marginalized groups or marginalized cultures. My last two slides on this Black Lives Matter theme address equity, the fundamental cry behind the recent social unrest in many countries. Equity is fair treatment, access, opportunity, advancement. It's not equality. When implemented effectively, equitable practices dismantle barriers, such as those making it so hard for women and people of color to become leaders of large companies or United States presidents, Supreme Court judges, or more importantly, restoration crew supervisors. Yeah. Equality, on the other hand, is the uniform distribution of resources. Everybody gets the same. In the baseball illustration, the littlest fellow on the left of the four boxes, he's given equal resources. He gets a box like everybody else, but he's still left only seeing the wooden board of a fence, while his taller friends have a great view of the game. In an equitable scenario, the littlest fellow would be provided resources needed to participate fully. The third version from the left is the reality perceived by many Black Lives Matter protesters. Ideally, the fence, as on the far right, is a structural barrier that can be taken down, and fan participation would be created equitable for everybody. Unfortunately, if you took down that barrier, you might have too many inside the park home runs, but you'd have equity. All right. I hope this 10-minute dive into racism and dominant and marginalized social identities sparks our creativity to learn more about ourselves and improve our partnerships to bring more of the 8 billion people on the planet into the restoration industry and that of conservation of natural resources, as if our lives and the generations that follow us depend on it. We can't do this with just a sliver of our population. Okay, well, that was a bit intense for me. I don't know about you all, but now we're going to move on to part two, very different than part one. This is about creativity and partnerships on a professional level. These are real names for real dirt roads on U.S. Army property, Fort Ord National Monument. The partnership between the Department of Defense and the Department of Interior, which includes the other BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, on this monument of 14,000 acres, has been a love fest of creativity, flexibility, spirited teamwork, and on-the-ground conservation progress. What else would you expect from large bureaucratic agencies, right? Well, we have oodles of fun on Fort Ord, but our serious motive is to welcome all slices of community through the generations for hands-on learning and loving their public land here since the early 1990s, when Fort Ord was slated to become the largest military base in the United States to close. In this photo, the Monterey Bay chapter of California Native Plant Society's field trip is enjoying those flowers so tiny that we've got to get down to their level with a hand lens to appreciate them. The ground muffled oohs and ahs expressed in these moments tell us the public is loving learning. But it takes time for land managers to create and host hundreds of these public weekend explorations, such as this. But these partnerships that are built are long-term and mutually beneficial. BLM and the Army, we do our best to manage for the protection of natural resources between the roads and trails. There's about 120 miles of routes for the public on Fort Ord National Monument, but on the roads and trails, we try to provide as much access as safely possible for as many constituents as possible. And here on the right, you see a Stanford University sponsored road bike race. Alongside that, to the left, you see a mountain bike competition that are the kind that occur annually on Fort Ord. And all of these require permits, staff time, and supervision to avoid impacts to natural resources. Although there's our 440,000 visitors every year to enjoy the monument, there's plenty of space, plenty of time for solitude amidst a beautiful nature, a very beautiful landscape. Here, a former BLM weed intern who became a CSUMB instructor and is now a doctorate student at UC Santa Cruz, John Detka, rides alone in the year 2000, a long time ago. All right, we transitioned from recreation to creative natural resource management examples of the partnership on Fort Ord. At BLM, our resource management plans marching orders for coastal grasslands include managing those grasslands for increased native bunch grasses, minimized fire hazard, limiting exotics, and increased biodiversity. In this slide, it's Manny Casanova and Allison that are enjoying collecting some data in a graze plot on an east-facing slope that's got some really good forb diversity and some bunch grasses there. It's a really nice photo. From 1997 to 2015, BLM utilized 700 ewes and 600 lamb, whereas the Army had some fire training activity here prior to the 90s and authorized 5,400 sheep, many more than the BLM does. Without the fence control, though, for targeted grazing within pens, sheep would move over large areas looking for what they prefer, forbs, and they tended to avoid the thicker grass, especially on north-facing slopes. Upon the sheep's departure in summer each year, tall grass and high biomass amounts would remain. Small residual grass populations of native poa, melica, festuca, elemus, danthonia, and low native forb concentrations indicated that the higher stocking rates of the past could have reduced the natives' abundance. And that's something that we're trying to turn around. Well, as in everything that we do on Fort Ord, the public were partners to our sheep grazing program. Their acceptance of the sheep grazing and the fact that their dogs killed or injured sheep on occasion required that we provide public education. So we had some creative fun with the sheep. We invited the public this day each year to see how wool was spun into yarn, how sheep were sheared. Sheep owner Erie Artie would speak to the public about the sheep industry. The sheepdogs and the herders would conduct herding demonstrations, and BLM staff would remind people about the sheep benefits and why they were there and why pet dogs were needed to be kept on leash near sheep. One memorable moment of Sheep Appreciation Day was when a band of sheep was spooked by people and some of the lambs jumped atop the hood of a nice BMW parked nearby. Similarly, we've had Dog Appreciation Day, similar message, keep your dogs on leash. But a lot of fun, a lot of dogs, and hopefully a lot of understanding of why we have the rules that we have for responsible visitation by the public on Fort Ord. Now we move to grazing research on Fort Ord. Bacris pilularis, coyote brush, or BOPI for short, was observed during the sheep years to be encroaching and be type converting the grassland to coyote brush scrub. So on the left here in 1998, there's a roughly rectangular 5-acre area where you can see some concentrations of coyote bush and some spattering of coyote bush elsewhere. But then when you move to 2012 in that same 5-acre area, you can see it's largely filled with coyote brush scrub. So that's what we were seeing happening across the landscape, and this was just one example. Here it is up close. The bottom of this valley is that 5-acre rectangle, but if you look to the right up the slope, you can see that it's happening on the slope as well. So about the time we were deciding what to do with the coyote brush encroachment, we had an offer we couldn't refuse to graze goats. The partners here include 2 Peruvian, 1 Mexican goat herder, various herding dogs, and Goats R Us company out of the Bay Area. The BLM oversight helps advise when and where to rotate these 3 different 600 goat herds in their respective winter and spring grazing areas, totaling 2,800 acres. The offloading of these goats, who are the major partner here, is often a hoot to watch when 300 goats per truck get out and leap with joy to be free in new areas with fresh food in abundance. And it's interesting, their favorite foods in priority order seem to be, number 1, lace lichen, followed in preference, acorns, oak leaves, green forbs, green grass, dry forbs, and lastly, dry grass. This seems to be the goat's order of favorite foods, and it's fun to watch them choose what to eat. The herding dogs, as partners, work remarkably hard under difficult conditions, and they intelligently heed the goat herder whistles, their verbal commands, hand signals to steer or reposition the goat herds. And these dogs, they love loving. All right. Now that we've introduced you to the goat grazing partners, what are the results of this partnership? There's been 7 years of data collection and 2 master theses, which have concluded the following. The top arrow summarizes the control results. As you can see, after 7 years without goat grazing, the annual grass and the non-native forbs are the only categories that significantly changed. Yellow font color equals significance. But the coyote bush was the same, the bunch grasses were the same, and the native forbs were the same. So you ended up with coyote brush scrub remaining in those ungrazed control areas that were studied. In the grazed areas that were studied, you had significantly less coyote brush over that 7-year period, same amount of bunch grass, you had more annual grass and more non-native forbs, same amount of native forbs, but overall, with a decrease in the woody and an increase in the herbaceous, you have coyote brush scrub being replaced by coastal grassland, which is what we were hoping we would see. Here's a photo showing both low fuel hazard and healthy native bunch grasses and forbs, the wildflowers. This is what we want, but most of our 2,500 acres of open grassland are dominated by annual non-native grasses. We do have 2 recently initiated studies trying to find creative goat grazing solutions that would move the annual grass cover in these open areas to favor more the native bunch grass and forb diversity. This is part of our marching orders. Well, the creativity we're trying to apply to the use and the research of goats could best be said to be in fluid motion. And Chris Hart, this Thursday at the SERCAL session, will be diving deep into this research. So I hope that you can catch his presentation in a couple of days from now. But with one eye that we have on what we're doing on Fort Ord with goats, we have another eye on what Rodrigo Sierra Corona and his coworkers are doing with Criollo cattle at the San Lucia Conservancy in Carmel Valley. These are relatively small cows that require less water. They do better on poor forage, such as tall, dry grass, than do American Angus cattle. Perhaps the creativity and partnership can result in summer Criollo trials on Fort Ord to reduce our tall summer grass, but that's in the future maybe. We're going to move on to a different kind of habitat restoration. It was 1997, where the creativity of CSU Monterey Bay undergrad Drew Reedy, who was employed at the time by our major restoration partner, Return of the Natives. Drew told BLM that we should have live music at our Saturday volunteer planting events. Well, long story short, we said, that sounds crazy, let's try it. Well, since then, each of our 69 Saturday planting events has been serenaded by live music such as Didgeridoo and Dixieland Jazz. It's been pretty awesome. Here's how we do our restoration. We start with either eroded, degraded roads, helipad sites, or parking lots, something like that nature. And then we bring in bulldozers and we fill them in and we recontour them. This is what it might look like after a month in this case. 2 years after, 7 years after, that was 2007, and now it looks largely the same, although it's actually probably ready for a fire because it's so mature at this point. Another site is a large groove or slot, a gap put in a hillside by every year's bulldozer grading. When the roads rut out and you want to smooth them out after the fall rains, it gets lower and lower. So this is a slot, and we use the same practice, bringing in the materials we need or taking them from on site, plant them after seeding and strawing. And then 10 years later, it looks like this with a little bit of open ground on the right. But we're monitoring that in all of our sites for weeds and erosion. And overall, they're doing pretty awesome. So this is a compilation of what we've done over those 23 years. On the right is a map showing in yellow the restored areas over the 7,200 acres that BLM manages on Fort Ord. This is a 6,000 acre piece. This is a 1,200 acre piece with a few acres here at our work center. So in those years of working those 221 sites, we've restored, as you can see, a total of 140 acres of the 7,200 plus that we have on BLM. And those are between these 8 plant communities, habitat types, with the majority of them being maritime chaparral, which is our priority because that's where most of our endangered species of plants occur, is in the maritime chaparral. So it's been a great 23 years, and I think we've got a lot done. We've learned a lot. We've included a lot of people, and this is a photo to end that segment of with our Jalisco harpist playing on Valentine's Day. And at least you can see on the right that one volunteer is enchanted by the whole scenario. So we're going to move to pigs now. They're quite cute when they're little. And from 1993 to 2004, that we were not aware of any history of pigs on Fort Ord. But between 2004 and 2006, they had become common and were damaging our vernal pools. This vernal pool is a place we call Butterfly Valley. It's beautiful with the endangered species of yellow Contra Costa goldfields in it, and surrounded by an unusual species of popcorn flower called Hickman's popcorn flower. But this is before pigs, 2004. This is after pigs, same exact site. So we'll go back. This is before, this is after. The pigs have a thick cartilage around their noses that they use to turn over soil, kind of like rototilling. And they consume anything edible, plants, animals that they can find. In this case, it's kind of interesting. There's thousands of wild onion bulbs, and the pigs just love those. So that's one thing that they're eating there. This is a nightly shot of mother sow and a couple of her young babies going into a trap at night with a camera that's mounted there. And the creative partners here were a massive volunteer effort that monitored for the pigs' presence, installed live traps, monitored the cameras, followed, and finally they were background checked, these volunteers, so they could be allowed to shoot the trapped pigs. The deceased pigs were given to families to eat, and between 2006 and 2017, we removed 110 pigs. Individual pigs may wander through Fort Ord occasionally, but we only trap them if they take up residence and start to cause damage. Our most creative partnership that we're very proud of is with a diverse pool of Monday through Friday volunteers, morning shifts, afternoon shifts. Each weekday, 2 to 6 volunteers walk in the door to work with us outside on all the projects we have going. One creative component Chris Hart's come up with is visiting university classrooms to inspire students to volunteer. When they do, BLM tries to check off as many skills as possible for each volunteer to learn, and to learn how to supervise others to learn that skill, so that each volunteer maximizes their resume building, in the case of these students. This is our version of a volunteer to career pipeline. Hundreds of volunteers and approximately 10,000 hours per year is the result. The partnership requires a lot of BLM staff time, but it greatly increases the work completed and the enjoyment for everybody in the workplace. This photo is with volunteers working with a CSU Monterey Bay class to collect some transect data. And this is some volunteers working with high school students to plant oaks to replace dead or dying oaks. We have a couple of special volunteer projects I want to highlight in ending this presentation, where Kathy Bell has voluntarily spent hundreds of hours photographing bobcats. Between 2004 and 2016, Kathy photographed and identified 45 different individual bobcats by their distinctive markings, either on their face or their legs or their tail. Anyway, at least we know that in that span of time, there were at least 45 bobcats. And the pictures that she came back with are wonderful to look at, and she's very generous in sharing her photos of bobcats. A couple of other volunteers, pretty special people, David and Jane Steyer, have been working for 15 years as volunteers and giving us about 55 hours per week in combination of the two of them. They've recorded 120,000 plant observation records. David has produced a book, The Flora of Fort Ord, which summarizes all the results of his years of effort. And they've provided hundreds of cookies to Army and BLM staff and volunteers. Here's Jane, known as the Cookie Lady, giving out some well-appreciated cookies. Lastly, I wanted to talk about California tiger salamander, where Robert Cooper at UCLA for his doctorate research has built 18 artificial vernal pools. Here are 12 of those 18. Each have different depths, so they hold water for different lengths of hydro periods. And the purpose is to try to find out if there's a certain hydro period, let's say 90 days as opposed to 150 days, that might give a selective advantage to the native tiger salamanders that are having a real onslaught of genetic pollution from the hybrid and non-native barred salamander. So as usual, we try to get as many people involved in these projects wherever they are. And there's Robert Cooper standing on the far right, and Joe Miller of the UC Natural Reserve on Fort Ord, who brought this class from UC Santa Cruz to the field trip. But if you look to the very upper left, there is a herd of 600 goats. So I think that's a pretty cool photo. All right, well, other than to say thank you for many people who have been our partners and hopefully will remain our partners in the future, that ends this kickoff presentation, and I hope that you've all enjoyed it, and I appreciate you hanging with me, for the entirety of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was a great kickoff presentation there, and thank you for addressing the hard to talk about, the elephant in the room, the BLM social justice stuff. So yeah, it's we need to talk about it and continue talking about it. And then all the stuff going on at Fort Ord, I forget how much. It's awesome. So many things, so many people, so many creative solutions and creativity. I love it. I love all the school kids and college kids and public and awesome volunteers out there.
Thanks, Thor. You were a big part of that, Thor, so thank you.
Oh, thanks.
And you're still out there in a different capacity, so you're still a big part of it.
Yeah, thank you. So at this time, folks and out there, if you have questions for Bruce, please use the Q&A, and Bruce could field some questions from you. Right now, the Q&A is empty. So Bruce, there used to be all the sheep, and now there's the goats. What was the difference of number of sheep versus goats in the day? Do you need more goats or less goats to do the same job?
We use more goats than sheep, and more importantly, we often use these fence, electric fences every night, and a lot of times during the day. The goats are in electric fenced areas so that we can move them exactly where we need them the most. And when they've eaten it down to where we want, then we let them out of the fenced area. We didn't have that control with the sheep. So we're getting better results, more controllable results with the goats. They're a more thorough eater because they're stuck in a fenced area until we let them out. So they're not able to just ice cream, pick out those ice cream plants like the sheep used to do.
Cool. Hey, we got a few questions rolling in. Has the river fire near Salinas impacted any of your Fort Ord projects?
Well, we had to shut down the monument for about 6 days. So we spent most of our time keeping people out. But in a way, all that ash falling, if it's enough of it, that's going to help enrich the soils. A lot of our soils are coastal sandy marine deposits, so they're pretty depauperate. And over the eons, fires have been happening and probably adding some nutrients to the soil. But in essence, really, no, not much impact at all that we could think of, other than for the people who couldn't go there for a while.
Okay, that question was from Jocelyn Curtis. Next question's Katie Gallagher. Where do you find most of your volunteers?
Most of our volunteers are CSU Monterey Bay students. The second most of our volunteers are groups of people that come throughout the year. These are high school, K through 12, special ed, colleges, some as far away as Vancouver. Sierra Club comes for a week. They bring about 10 volunteers for a week once a year. They'll be back in March. So we have a lot of groups coming in, and these volunteers from CSU Monterey Bay help to take on these groups so that they can learn how to supervise different ages and put that on their resume as well. Mostly they're from CSU Monterey Bay.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Here's a question from Greg Andrew, our past SERCAL president. He's asking, is there any one thing that can be done in restoration industry to increase diversity and opportunities for minorities?
Yeah, I think once you get them, you got to keep them. And the only way to keep them is to have a cultural environment where they feel comfortable. If it's Eurocentric and they're just stuck in it, it's like a fish out of water. It's probably not going to work. That was my example of, if you get an African American to join your team and it doesn't work out, you really have to question whether that team ever really included that person or just tried to go about our normal ways, which might not relate very well for that person's sense of comfort. I was talking to a director of a local nonprofit, well known in Monterey County, about this. He said, yeah, we had a person of color on our board once and it didn't work out very well. It was really complicated. It's like, yeah, it's hard to work it out well unless you understand inclusivity. And most nonprofits, city councils, government agencies, they don't have a real inclusive atmosphere because they're from a different culture. So it's hard for them to understand how to be different, to be receptive for different people that don't see life the way that a dominant culture sees life. So it's a real tough one. But the one thing, if I could say anything, it would be to find ways to make your environment comfortable for people who don't share your identities.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. We are running out of time for more questions, so maybe you could answer some of these by typing the text on the Q&A during the next presentation for folks.
All right. Thanks, Thor. Thanks, everybody.
At this time,